welcome, wherever you are in the world, to this Global Government Forum webinar to launch the Global Citizen Experience Survey, looking at how public services are standing up to unprecedented pressures. My name is Richard Johnson, and I'm the Executive Editor of Global Government Forum, which is a media and events company focused on bringing together public and civil servants from around the world to share best practice. And in partnership with our knowledge partner, Appian, we conducted a survey of public servants to find out how they judge public services to be responding to pressures that include a once-in-a-century pandemic, high inflation, tight budgets, volatility caused by global conflict, and mass industrial action. There's a lot of interesting findings in this research, and in today's session, I will outline some of the key findings from the report, and then we will also hear from our panel of public service experts to get their response to the key findings. And it is a great panel that we've got to discuss the report today, and I will introduce them to you in just a second. But before I do that, I also want to say that we'd like to hear from you, everybody watching along on the webinar today, about your thoughts on how the services you deliver are responding to the pressures that government faces. How would you rate the services that your department produces? Do you think that higher workloads are impacting the quality of those services? And what would your priorities be to perhaps improve the services that you deliver and maybe alleviate some of those pressures? Please do get in touch using the Q&A button that you will see on wherever you're watching this webinar, and we will have time later today in today's session to put your thoughts and questions to our panel. So let me introduce that panel. Firstly, we're joined by Peter Corp. Peter is the industry leader for the UK public sector in Appian, who, as I mentioned, were our knowledge partner for this research project and report. So after I have set out the kind of key findings from the report, Peter will provide the Appian perspective. We're also joined today by Michael Vernick, the Jarolowski Chair of Public Sector Management at the University of Ottawa and former clerk of the Privy Council and Secretary to the Cabinet in the Canadian Government. Michael's distinguished career saw him become one of the key leaders of Canada's federal public service, culminating in his time as clerk. And prior to being clerk, he had 17 years as a deputy minister, the equivalent to a departmental permanent secretary for those versed in the UK system, which makes him one of Canada's most experienced and influential public sector leaders. Also, perhaps of interest for this conversation, in October 2021, Michael published a book called Governing Canada, a guide to the tradecraft of politics, which serves as a practical handbook for Canada's political leaders and those who aspire to understand them. So that will be interesting contribution, I'm sure, for this conversation too. Welcome, Michael. We're also joined by Annie Chang, the Chief Evaluation Officer, and Director for Evidence Research and Evaluation Policy at the US Department of the Treasury. In her role, Annie oversees agency efforts to set and execute the department's research and evaluation priorities and to identify and address gaps in the Treasury's ability to build and use evidence. This includes managing initiatives to mature the department's infrastructure, capability and culture to promote evidence-based decision-making, as well as facilitating and interrogating meaningful use of data and using evidence in the department's in understanding the department's strategic objectives and organizational management routines. And before her current role, Annie served as the department's organizational performance lead, leading a team that was responsible for the coordination and development of the Treasury's strategic plan. So welcome, Annie, as well. So we'll hear from our panel shortly, but before we do, I will set out some of the key findings from the report. And we'll also share a link to the report if you want to learn more. So if we move on to the slide, Raquel. That's the cover of the report. And the next slide after this, we'll set out a little bit of the rationale. Move on to that. Yeah, governments around the world have kind of rarely faced as much pressure as they do now. And this survey was designed with Appian to help understand public servants' perception of the work that they face, the workloads that they face, and of the quality of the services that they deliver. We received a total of 1,149 responses from public servants around the world, and respondents to the report were grouped geographically to understand trends and differences in different locations, which you will see in the next few slides. There are 6 key conclusions from the report that I'm going to set out with you. And just to let you know, we will make these slides available after the session too. So next slide, please, Raquel. So the first takeaway that I want to share is that public service workloads are significantly increasing. When we asked the respondents to the survey if their workload had increased significantly since the start of the coronavirus pandemic, over half of respondents, 56%, as you see on that graph there, said they agreed or strongly agreed that it had. And as you can see from the graph, this feeling was most strongly felt in New Zealand and the United Kingdom, where while a majority also agreed that their workload was increasing in the US, in Mexico, Italy, and Canada. And the exceptions where there weren't majorities for that proposition were in Spain and Germany, but even in those cases, again, you'll see from the graph, more people agreed than disagreed that their workload had gone up. Next slide, please, Raquel. And linked to that, 28% of global respondents said the quality of the work that they carry out had been affected by, as a result of the increased demand. We asked if the quality of their work had suffered, and overall 48% of officials disagreed with that proposition, but still that it was more than 1 in 4 who agreed or strongly agreed that that the quality of their work had suffered as a result of demand pressures. And again, you'll see from that graph some specific differences. Respondents are most certain that workloads had an impact on the quality of their work in the UK, which is the only country where more people agreed than disagreed that the quality of services had fallen. And compared to the overall sample, a higher proportion of public servants agreed about the quality of their work suffering in New Zealand, the United States, and Spain. The point at the end, the second point, bullet point there, is a quote from the report from Michael, not to steal too much of what he might touch on in his session, but he highlighted as part of the report that there was kind of wear and tear that public services were facing after years of pressure, and citizen expectations of government were growing all the time. So governments need to keep pace with those. And yeah, we'll hear more of Michael's thoughts shortly. Next slide, please, Raquel. So in the survey, we also asked public servants to rate what they viewed to be the citizen experience of the services that they provide in government. How good is the citizen experience of what they do? And you can see from the individual national responses on that graph there, but overall, the top global bar at the top, 42% of respondents said the citizen experience was good or excellent, 29% said it was average, and 12% said it was poor or extremely poor. We then calculated a weighted mean score from these percentage calculations, and it equated to a weighted mean score of 6 out of 10 was the rating that public servants gave the services that they provide, although interestingly only 47% said that they were very confident in the rating that they gave. So there's a degree of uncertainty too around that number. And you can see from the graph the countries where public servants rate the citizen experience of the services that they provide highest was in Italy, followed by Mexico and the United States. Those are the countries where over half of respondents say the services they provide are good or excellent. The country where most public servants say that the services they provide are poor, extremely poor, had the highest proportion was in New Zealand. And interestingly, the country with the second highest proportion of officials saying services were extremely poor was the United States. So there was a strong views on both sides of the debate in the US. Bear that in mind as we go on to the next slide, please, Raquel. We also then asked public servants to rate the quality both of the public services that they themselves use, so not those that they are involved in providing, but the ones that they use, and a host of other services from their day-to-day life to allow for comparison. And the headline is that public servants rated their own experience of public services at just over 5 out of 10, using the same weighted mean score from the percentages you can see on that graph. So public servants say that the services they provide are 6 out of 10 for citizens, but they say that the services that they experience from government are just 5 out of 10, so a whole point lower. And it is interesting that you can see from the graph the other services that public servants rate highly. Banking and finance are the highest good or excellent ratings amongst public servants, which I will use for this section of the discussion, even though the weighted mean score calculation in the report is slightly different. And you can see it's followed by retail and insurance, above where public servants think the citizen experience of their services are, and then energy and utilities, healthcare and telecommunications are also above their own experience of public services. And then their own experience of public services is only above 3 other kinds of services that they use, those delivered by local government. So this, remember, the questions were about central government services. Airlines and pensions are all rated lower than public servants' own experience of government. So next slide, please, Raquel. Just another area we explored in the research is the extent to which public servants expect services to be digital wherever possible. And again, you can see from this graph, the majority do indeed expect this, and expectations that public services should be digital wherever possible are highest in Germany and Italy, and over half of public servants agree that that should be the case in Canada, Mexico, and Spain. Interestingly, and slightly counterintuitively to me, when I was looking through the findings of the report for the first time, was that expectations were lowest in the United States. You'll see the bar at the bottom there. We also asked public servants the extent to which they think technology could significantly improve public sector productivity. 2/3 of respondents, 66%, said that it could indeed help, and there's some more information on that on the next slide. So next slide, please, Raquel. So we'd asked that question, can technology help improve productivity? And 2/3 responded that it could. But other questions drilled a bit more into that technology question. We also asked officials if they think technologies such as artificial intelligence could help reduce their workload, and 41% agreed that that could be the case, compared to just 25% who disagreed. And then we asked, what is your involvement in process improvement and automation in your role at the moment? And that's the graph you can see there. I found it very interesting that 1/3 of public servants already say that they play either a supporting or leading role in process improvement and process automation within their organizations. And again, you can see some slight national differences there, where it seems like governments are making quicker progress on process improvement and process automation. Mexico, Italy, and New Zealand and Germany all greater than the overall global sample size in terms of public sector involvement. And the next and final slide for me, just as part of this whistle-stop survey, summary of the survey, is the result of our question asking public servants what their priorities are in the months ahead. The second bar you see on that chart is the global results. So you will see that improving accessibility of services, the lime green bar, is the furthest on, and that was the only priority that received over 50% from the total overall global sample. And eliminating duplication and errors was second most frequently highlighted, and improving customer service was the third most highlighted amongst the global sample. But you can also see from the graph, this is the dark green lines are the United States, but we can do these graphs with every country. There are differentiations between what the priorities are of public servants in different countries. Improving the accessibility of services remained the top priority in Italy, Mexico, and New Zealand. But as you can see from that graph, in the United States, the priority was improving customer services, which was prioritized more than any other nation, a finding that is in line with the kind of emphasis on customer experience that President Biden has placed on federal services. In terms of other nations' top priorities, eliminating duplicate work and errors was the top priority amongst public servants in Canada, Spain, and the UK, while in Germany, the top priority was improving correspondence and case management. So there's some different priorities in different countries, which was a very interesting finding. As I said, there's more detail on that in the report. As was alluded to in the first slide, public servants will need to respond to these pressures while also dealing with those increasing workloads. As I mentioned, 61% of respondents say they expect their workload to increase in the months ahead. Only 12% of officials disagreed that their workload wasn't going to increase further. So these priorities really need to be balanced, or taking action to meet these priorities needs to come while also working with increasing caseloads and workloads as the pressures on public services increase. So that's just a very quick overview of the findings of the report. I'm very happy to answer any questions when we get into the Q&A portion of the session. But before we do so, let's hear some responses to the findings from the rest of our panel, starting with Peter. Peter.
Hi, Richard. Hello, everybody. Absolutely delighted to be here. I think it's an absolutely fascinating topic that we've all seen firsthand in various different shapes and forms, whether that's working in public sector directly or whether that's as us interacting with them. I think the report probably tells us a lot of what we probably felt, but seeing the data around that is always interesting for sure. I think one of the main challenges that we face is to try and answer the question of why is government under the immense pressure that it needs, and what does it need to do to change? And that prompts all sorts of different areas for debate. We were talking earlier before we went live about how public sector seems to add on to its pile of things that it needs to deal with. It's constantly taking on more and more and more. And it's very difficult for it to shed away services that maybe are no longer needed by the majority or very few. So there's always going to be challenges around the workload capacity with that. I think one of the biggest challenges we face is the expectations that we all have of public sector based on our own experiences in the private world, whether that's ordering a pizza or whether that's getting something delivered to your door. It sets almost an artificially high bar for what we as citizens expect. And I think that always creates some challenges in and around that space. Equally, on top of that, the budgets and resources typically only go in one direction. We get less of them each year than we've had in the previous year. And all the time, those expectations are increasing. So you've got these two things going in opposite directions. And we seem to try and make savings in the obvious places, which are, dare I say, more the quick and easy, rather than the long-term strategic places. So we do a tactical fix here and there, rather than maybe the difficult choice of something that's going to take a lot longer. And that could be for political reasons, technological reasons, all sorts of different factors part in that. And then equally, I think our ability to influence what's changed in the first place. We're all in a position to be able to change that to a given extent. But if we don't manage to achieve that, that control, that influence may no longer be there. And it's only a matter of Googling a couple of interesting situations where we've seen, certainly here in the UK, some councils declaring themselves bankrupt because they can no longer fund some of the services that they used to do, which is removing the control away from that, and maybe outsourcing as well, which is another challenge whereby you're not necessarily delivering the full service that you want to, you're having to do it in a way that it's a commercially appropriate one, but what consequences come as a result of that? And if we look at the culture and the technology of what's required to help bring organizations together, I think we've all experienced different interactions through COVID. But the one thing that for me stood out proud was how public sector brought together multiple departments, processes, people through COVID to a fantastic outcome. Everybody rallied around it, nations came together. Globally, we managed to do something that was absolutely formidable. But why can't we do that more regularly? Why can't we figure out what the process is, what the user need is, and do that a bit more as normal, dare I say, business as usual? Not that I'm suggesting we need COVID all the time to improve our services. Clearly, that wouldn't be a great idea. But equally, some of the local things I can now book online to go to my local recycling centre. I would never have been able to have done that pre-COVID. But now that I'm into that mix and I do take that approach, it means I don't have a queue to sit in for hours and on end at the weekend because everybody's turned up at the recycling centre at the same time. So there's benefits as a result of that. I think we need to apply that more universally. One of the other areas is looking at the processes for how government uses its information and improves its efficiency. And it was really interesting, Richard, in the article that 66% of people were saying that technology could improve the productivity. I kind of want to go and ask some of those people, well, why isn't it then? What's holding you back? What's the inertia behind those bits and pieces? And they suggested that AI could probably, I think it was 41% thought that AI had a part to play in that. I think it does, but it's not going to fix everything. Technology is not the answer to solve all of these problems. It has its part to play, but we as humans need to be in the mix of that to deal with the exception handling, probably no more so than in public sector. We have a human at the end of it, somebody that needs our care, our attention, our services, our time. It's not just getting pizza into Pete's household, which can create some fallout, but that's clearly not necessarily the most important thing at the time. And the one thing I see frequently through my time in public sector over 25 plus years is all too often we get into a bit of a rut, into that stale world of always doing things the way that we've always done them and not challenging why we make those decisions. If we can get into that beginner's mindset, and again, I point back to the COVID experience where we were forced into a situation that we wouldn't have chosen to have done, but it made us reset and rethink about what our approaches were. I think we can achieve greatness through that. So I think if we can bring that beginner's mindset into everything that we do, I think we will create some fantastic services. And the bit that stood out for me in your recent talks out there, Richard, was that 2/3 of people were not involved in the process improvement. We're all involved in the process in one way, shape or form. That's why we're all here. But if we're not listening to 2/3 of that community, then aren't we missing a trick there somewhere? And I think only through that understanding of the process, documenting it, sharing it, getting it out of people's minds that we can all visualize it will make a big difference. And the last thing I'll leave before I witter on for too long, I've often facilitated sessions with government whereby you get different departments in a room, and the amount of times I've done that and people go, I didn't know you did that, or why are you asking for that bit of information over there, because we never use it over here. And it's that joined up nature of bringing those together. And if we've got 2/3 of people that aren't even involved in that, then it's no wonder that we're not making the efficiencies that maybe we should do. I'll hand you back, Richard.
Great, thank you, Peter. Very good, interesting points in the response there. And yeah, I think that's a very good point at the end about trying to join up the views and kind of the knowledge of the people who are delivering these services on the front line with these transformation programs and improvement programs, because there's a lot of benefit that can be harnessed from those who are kind of directly involved in delivering services to citizens. And yeah, the example of how government was able to change at speed during the pandemic is, I think, one that organisations are going to be studying for years to try and learn the lessons from. That is excellent contribution. Thank you to the conversation. Please do keep your questions coming in, because we'll be moving to Q&A very shortly. But before we do so, a couple more contributions. First from Michael.
Thank you, Richard, and forgive me if there's a bit of background noise here. And thank you to Global Government Forum and Appian for doing the piece of work. I think it leads to all kinds of interesting lines of inquiry. We can come back specifically to some of the issues around going global or why workload is perceived as increased. Just by way of opening provocative remarks, I mean, I would say that I see this as a bit of a snapshot in a trend. My experience is that the relationship between government services and the public, the users, the taxpayers, is asymptotic. Those lines that get closer and closer but never touch. You never arrive at a point where people are happy and satisfied and we got there. There will always be pressure to keep moving and keep improving. When you look back, at certainly the sort of outward-facing services of governments that I've had any contact with, the gains in speed, accuracy, customizations, 24/7 availability are incredible, beyond anything anybody would have put in a project proposal 20 years ago. The proliferation of personalization, my account approaches, direct deposit of payments, the migration from in-person towards call centers, towards phone websites, and now apps has been going on and steadily progressing. In Canada, about 90% of transactional interactions with government are now done online. And that's an incredible story. It does you no good whatsoever in the current environment, struggling for attention and resources. But I think among public servants, it's useful to look back as a lesson that, yes, we know how to do these things. We know how to transform and change and strive for better. It's always been a case of the public sector slipstreaming the private sector. The private sector can take risks, the public sector never can. And so the breakthroughs in payment systems and service and queue management took place in banking and retail, and they wrote off hundreds of millions of dollars of failed projects in a way the public sector could never do. And you learn from what is best practice in private sector applications and say, oh, we could apply this to something that government delivers. The gains in accessibility are not insignificant. In Canada, everything's done in 2 official languages, and we're now adding more options for a lot of the service interactions. And the gains for people with accessibility issues, visual and hearing disabilities, for example, have been tremendous. And that's where you can be a bit of a techno-optimist. I think one of the distinctions I always try to make is that the private sector can largely choose its customers. They can go after markets and they can ignore others. That's why we have things like food deserts. They can decide, well, those people I don't care to make any effort to reach. Governments, certainly democratic governments, are very, very reluctant to do that, and they spend a lot of time actually chasing the last 10 or 15% of the target population, trying to get to people who are not applying for benefits or taking up services that they've offered. And so you spend a lot of time at the tail of distributions when you're working in public services. I was certainly struck by the range across countries. What I always come back to is that services in a federation is a particular challenge. At a minimum, you're going to have issues of interaction of the national government with local government, certainly in the UK or New Zealand. In Canada, Germany, Australia, other places, you get complex policy and program interactions between national, provincial, and state governments and local governments. When one level of government's doing employment insurance and another one's doing social assistance, easier said than done to link the policies and programs, let alone the IT systems. I would say one of my other sort of typical sort of rants is about it's easier to get resources and attentions for the outward-facing transactional services to individuals, families, and businesses. But the externally facing services, they rest on a rather creaky foundation of intermediate services and internal services. So a lot of the public servants in the survey, that's a question, but a lot of public servants certainly spend time on intermediate services, financial advice, audit, evaluation, legal advice, policy advice, and so on, which citizens don't see and may assume doesn't happen, but they're obviously important. And the area that is the most difficult to get attention on is the foundation of internal services, personnel, finance, contracting, procurement, information management, records management, IT, and so on. And it's very, very difficult to deliver excellent externally facing services if you don't make the investments in technology and training on the internal services foundation on which the external services rest. On workload, just quickly, I mean, I have trouble figuring out the post-pandemic effects, partly because I wasn't in government for them. My theory of the case is that the pace was quickening before the pandemic. That government's expectations are to roll out things faster. The cycle times are shorter. Pace of change, or rate of change in that mathematical line is faster. Governments have decided that they can customize and they can deliver more kinds of boutique services and niche services, special allowances, special programs, special funds. So there's a bit of a proliferation of the public sector going on. It's a bit like if you add a lane to the highway, it will fill with traffic. Well, technology's allowed more government services, so governments offer more of them to their citizens. And I agree with Peter's point that it's obviously difficult to shed old and legacy programs, and it usually takes some very large scale spending and program review to do any serious pruning of the public sector. I'm reasonably optimistic actually on the potential that the emergent technology provides. We could talk about that in greater depth, but the key issue there is trust. There's a lot of skepticism of the state and its intentions and its responsiveness. And I think in the service world, in the public sector, trust is an important issue, which makes privacy protection, cybersecurity, vigilance against racial and gender bias in the algorithms, high standards that public sector services have to provide. And I think there's a danger in going digital of ignoring the people that have poor access to digital services and platform and skills. And you end up with a sort of digital Kafka and we've had that experience with some of our daughters' things. You need an address to access government services. Well, one of the services you're trying to get is housing. You can get yourself into a very bizarre kind of cycle of trying to deal with governments, which frustrate people. I'd like to see AI unleashed on staffing, on hiring, on selection processes, on procurement and contracting, on legal advice, on audit and evaluation. I think the frontier for the public sector is going to be the intermediate services and the internal services. It's not difficult to get politicians to focus on external services when the feedback loops are intense, as we saw in Canada around the passport office. Last comment I would say is about the pandemic. Yes, there was an immense focus and attention during the pandemic to public health programs and to economic support programs, and public services did an amazing job. But what we're now finding in 2022 and 2023 is an awful lot of other things were neglected and have drifted. And there's a big snowplow, to use a Canadian metaphor, of catch up going on. Well, what about this thing you promised? And what about that program? Well, the focus was relentlessly on public health and economic supports. And guess what? A lot of other things just couldn't get time with the minister or time at cabinet. So I'm skeptical of the why can't we do things in wartime. In wartime, the priority is the war. So, but I think I'm more optimistic that there was an accelerator effect, that resistance crumbled in court systems, universities, school boards, health systems, doctors, resistance to using online booking systems for appointments and so on. Many, many stories that I think there was a sort of a great leap forward, to use a terrible metaphor, in terms of a lot of the services provided by the broader public sector, by which you have to include the teachers, the doctors, the universities, the courts, the police, and so on. And actually, that's a very good story. I mean, it's not all about benefits and allowances and business licenses. The broad public sector includes a lot of very change-resistant, difficult politics to reform. And I think we're seeing, green shoots of reform in a lot of those areas. And it makes me reasonably optimistic. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Michael. Great to have some optimism in this conversation, which can sometimes veer on the pessimistic, and that's maybe just my Scottish accent to proceedings. Really, really interesting contribution there, particularly around the potential on AI as well, which I do think there's definitely a lot of interest in across governments at the moment. We pick that up in our work all the time. And yes, I'm very keen on examples of where AI is being deployed. So anybody who has any, please do get in touch. I find that the kind of where they're getting the rubber to hit the road on some of these technology projects to be really interesting. We will have questions after we hear some initial opening comments from Annie. So please do keep your questions coming in. We've got a few in already, so thank you very much to everybody who has done so. We will get to them shortly after we hear from Annie. Annie.
Thank you, Richard. Hi, everyone. My name is Annie Chang. I work at the U.S. Department of Treasury. I think one thing that stuck out with me so far with the study, as well as the previous panelists, Peter and Michael, is that the feeling of demand, the feeling of expectation, and the feeling of innovation and the expectation of innovation, alongside with what we all have been seeing in the past 5-10 years, with unprecedented level of global conflicting conflicts that are happening. With the pandemic, it was a generational type of event that happened to all of us. And so in the United States, as I'm sitting in public service for nearly 13 years now, it is helpful to see that a lot of the struggles that we're seeing on demand and on increasing workload is shared with so many countries and so many other public servants that are in the space just differently. What I want to do today is to think about the cost of performance and the cost of service. And I think when we look into, for the federal government, the services and outcomes and mission that we provide, what working in the public performance space and understanding and tracking progress has always been saying, we will do an A+ job. Tax filing season will happen. We will get the checks to you. We will be able to do all these services in the best way we can, even in the pandemic. And a lot of what doesn't get discussed is the cost of performance. Peter mentioned in his opening remarks about the resourcing and budgeting that doesn't usually come with the demand. And we are very keen on experiencing that, even in the United States right now. And for those who are following, we had a looming government shutdown with budget recently when our fiscal year expires at the end of September. And I think we're doing that again and running those motions again for our November 17th deadline for the government to be shut down again. So in those cases where there are non-parallel resourcing that happens, what do we do? And how do we quantify and understand what those risks and challenges are for us to mitigate? Michael mentioned something really interesting about the private sector is able to take on a lot more risk, and those failures that you fail fast, and once you fail fast, you figure out what works and what doesn't. For us in government, we have a different type of environment in which we operate on. And so in the idea of taking risk, understanding how we manage risk and understanding the mitigations and accepting our risk tolerance is also very different. And with that said, understanding organizational health is a way in which my department right now, and I won't represent the entire United States government in this end, but we are collectively thinking about how are we talking about organizational health. And I'll pause here for a moment just to explain a little bit about what organizational health is to us, in that it is about performance, resiliency, and capacity. So resiliency is the ability for us to respond back to triggering events and change. Some of the conversations that we've had with our leaders within the Treasury Department is the change load. And so we've all experienced this: one thing happens and it doesn't close for a new event to happen, or a new triggering event. And how do you deal with multiple change loads that happen? And expectations of customers and expectations of citizens is one of them. Understanding that innovation is always going to be striving for us to do better, do faster. And Michael's remarks, he mentioned 90% of the transaction that the Canadian government is online. I think there is that. Soon the expectation is not near, because our experience in private sector, for the government to react that way too. I would definitely consider that as a demand signal and change flow that could potentially be happening and changing the way in which we do the work. And so understanding the resiliency part and how resilient your organization is to adapt to these change events. But also there's a really big cultural part of where you move your workforce to those positions, and also future states of where you need to be. And unless you have those conversations early on at the leadership level, but also pulling it through at the management level and all the way down to the workers, et cetera, it is going to take time to move major organizations. Treasury is 100,000 people strong, if not more, to a place of a future state that can tolerate, but also accept and adapt, while doing the A+ work and service delivery that we have always needed to do and want to do. The other part about capabilities and capacity on organizational health then is in regards to where are your resourcing, not just about workforce. So understanding the infrastructure of data, the infrastructure of technology, but also your physical infrastructure. What does your facilities look like? Are we aging in infrastructure? Are we aging in architect that we really need to think about investing in? Because 10 years, 20 years down the line, we are actually going to be chasing or using bad technology that will not help us with the efficiency of our work, that could help us with performance and innovation. So looking at those head on early enough so we can prevent and or mitigate some of those risks before they become challenges. And so, we are opening a conversation on thinking about how to handle demand and how to handle health in a way that is in consideration of the cost of performance. And I think we are still maturing really in this space. I think the public sector lags a little bit with the private sector in this area. But our mission and also our demand and our existence and environments are very, very different. And how do we now think about health in a way that could be useful, that talks about the expectations and services and innovation that we all want to get there, but with the cost of it, and where is it going to give? It's not always asking, unfortunately, for money, because sometimes it just doesn't get it. And so in places where you have to do more with less, where are our options and how can we collectively still serve the public domestically and abroad with all of our things that we want to do. So Richard, I'll stop there. Happy to take any questions and further discuss health in general.
Great, thanks, Annie. That's a really interesting perspective, and it plays into one of the questions that I wanted to put to the panel. And I'll just put this direct to you, Annie, and then we can spread it out to everyone else. Because you touched on it there in your answer, but I'm wondering your thoughts on the kind of direct question. Are increasing workloads inevitable for public servants, or do you think that the perspective of organizational health and looking at these things in the round as you've just set out can mitigate the increase in pressures from kind of hitting the individual public servant on the front line or sitting at their desk?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question, and I think about this a lot because as a person who is in public service, but also planning to be in public service for the rest of my career, I have experienced personally increased workloads, and I've seen as I've gone through, team lead and management, also increased amount of work, but not enough people to do it, or not enough of the technology efficiently that we can kind of move on to. And so I think the conversation will need to pivot. We always will try to kind of get the resources we need, calibrate the expectations, but also the outcomes, either publicly or internally, to get to that delivery of what we can do. But is really thinking about forward-wise, the cost of performance and also our resiliency capabilities. And can we function in a space where we can invest more on, for example, resilient culture? Or can we start training our leaders, executive leaders, to be more resilient in these spaces, demand being one of them, so that they can move the organization and steer the organization in a way where when demand does come, what is the plan? To kind of get people upskilled so that you're not facing the storm in a way where you're not knowing how to drive the boat, for example, or steer the boat. And then being able to foundationally carry the workforce to a place where, yes, this might be something consistent that we might need to see. And so how are we instilling, like I said before, upskilling, but training, hiring the right type of techniques and technical experience and support to be able to do these work, that could alleviate some of those fear that, now I started in this position doing something very different than I am now. Am I still equipped to be able to contribute in a way that's meaningful and substantive?
Thank you. I don't know, Michael, if you have any thoughts on kind of whether increased workloads are kind of baked in to some degree as these pressures increase.
Well, I think it probably depends on what part of the public sector you're working on. A lot of the very transactional services have migrated to online delivery, so people are managing very, increasing volumes of caseloads. Most of the work goes to the complex cases, and the tails of distributions and the non-standard cases take more time and attention than the vast bulk of them. I would say, at the risk of upsetting people, that the more important issue is the optimization and the use of the resources that you do have. I mean, people in the public sector are squeamish about having conversations on productivity. People like to say truth to power, but they run away from internal conversations. Anybody who's worked in a work unit knows that there are some people who do more work than others, and that there are people in the public sector who are passengers and poor performers, and the public sector is not very good at dealing with them. So, and there are issues around presenteeism. Last time I saw some numbers, there's about 10% of the workforce is not at work today because they're on various forms of sick leave and disability leaves and so on. So, if you have 100 units of salary or people, I think optimizing the work across your team is still the biggest challenge for middle managers, and they're not all good at it. And so I think training and development of the middle management category is really, absolutely crucial. And it's surprisingly hard to get focus and time and attention to that. The other thing I'll say that doesn't make me popular is that there's a sort of perception that among public servants that change initiatives are extra, they're extra work, or being sent on training is extra work. And so they will answer questions saying, I've got more work to do because I was sent on a mandatory training course, or because there's this change initiative that the deputy head is asking for people to sit on committees on, and so on. And I think that kind of skews the perceptions a little bit. I'm not going to debate methodology, but I mean, from my perspective, training is part of the work, and change initiatives are part of the work. They're not extra. So, and that, again, that behooves the middle management category to find ways to carve out time and space and energy for that reinvestment. Private sector is much better at talking about reinvestment and recapitalizing their workforce than the public sector is.
And Peter, do you want to share some thoughts on?
Yeah, just briefly, Richard, thank you. I think it's a fascinating topic, And I think workloads have actually grown for everybody, and some different industries more than others potentially. You know, the kind of work from home ability that a lot of people now have means you start working at 7 o'clock in the morning and you're probably still going at 7, 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night, whereas previously that would have been unheard of. So I think it's stretched everybody in various different directions. The one thing that stands out for me is those people, those companies, those departments that have the agility and the flexibility to work with it are the ones that will survive it better. And for me, this is probably one of the key areas, is that we always find a way through, very much to Annie's point. Everybody gets their paycheck eventually. It will come. That's what we're here to do. The trick is where can we get the efficiencies in dealing with the volume? Because if we can handle that bit, then we can do the exception handling. And that's where we really do need to put the time, the energy, the effort, and look after people. And if we can't deal with the volume, then something suffers at the wrong end of the equation. And that's where it's going to hurt people, physically hurt people. And that's nowhere where we need to be. So for me, it's around the efficiencies and processes and making sure we put the attention on those to deal with the volume. And in my own personal world, the last organization I want to phone up is here in the UK, HMRC or DWP or DVR. I really don't want to talk to them, but it's usually a position of last resort where I can't self-serve and I can't find any other way of doing it. And then I'll pick the phone up. Why am I picking the phone up? What point in my journey did something fail and the process not work whereby I needed to do the break class procedure? How do I get around that? So for me, it's very much around finding those efficiency gains, visualizing them, making sure everybody's working to the same agenda and the same goal. And then I think maybe we can get the workloads to be manageable. But at the moment, I think at the emotional level, it doesn't feel like it is.
Great. Thank you very much. We've had a couple of questions on the report itself, which I would I'll just provide a little bit of additional information on. We have a question from Hannah Mead asking for the age distribution of respondents. And she said, I tend to find there are big differences in opinion generationally. That we don't have the age data for this particular cohort of respondents to this report, but it's a very good point that you make, Hannah. In some other work that I've been doing, it's speaking with very senior public servants. It's became very clear to me in the last couple of months how much governments are being shaped by the different views of particular younger people who are coming into the workforce, more technologically savvy, and kind of with different expectations of how their work is going to be done, and the capabilities that's going to be made available for them to deliver. So I think there's definitely scope for more research on that, on the different generational views of public servants. We have a question from Adesola Adepe, apologies if I'm not pronouncing that right, who asks which other countries were involved in the report. So the ones that we highlight in the graphs are the ones where we had kind of enough responses to kind of group respondents in a sensible way. We had a further 28 countries that we got responses from, and that was 118 responses. Those are included in the overall number, the overall response rate, but they weren't big enough to get into a national breakdown in the graphs that we used on the report. So that's why we focused on the countries that we have. Another question that we have had submitted was touching on the trust issue that I think Michael discussed about kind of cybersecurity. We've had a question that asks, what is the impact of cyber attacks on the public's confidence of government handling of their data digitally, and the potential for that to be lost or misused? I mean, the issue of kind of trust, I think, is becoming increasingly pertinent for governments as they try and undertake kind of digital transformation. Michael, do you have any thoughts on how governments can kind of address the trust issue, the best way to show people that kind of their data is safe, and address what we often find is that people are in fact happier or more willing to share their data with private organizations than public ones?
Yeah, it's a big topic. I mean, cybersecurity is a non-negotiable, you know, for anybody setting up a public sector service, and it raises issues about, you know, where the defenses and the perimeter should be. Canada has a very centralized approach to cybersecurity that served us very well. Other countries have taken different approaches. I'm not sure, you know, people will only notice these issues when there's a breach, you know, and there's a breach at a financial services company or a bank or whatever, and then people get upset. The public sector is held to higher standards because you're holding people's personal information about their health or their income or you know, any number of things. So I think it just becomes a, you know, a design factor. The trust issue, I think, is more, you know, is government responsive to me? Does it get me? Does it understand me and my financial, you know, my family situation? The sort of, you know, to use very old language, the alienation from government, the sense that, you know, the system is rigged and works for other people has been very corrosive of politics in a number of countries, from the US to Germany to France to the UK. So I think in order to maintain the trust of citizens, voters, taxpayers, it is directly tied, in my view, to the idea of responsiveness, that government is listening and empathetic and gets me, and it isn't working for other people. And so it actually has a lot to do with the program design and the delivery platforms. There is a lot of suspicion of government out there, and I think public servants, I think, are a bit naive about how the world sees government. About 10 or 15% of the North American population are deep down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories and the deep state and so on. And that makes it a bit challenging to deliver pensions to them and so on. So I think we have to, you know, we have to have an open conversation about trust issues. There is empirical work. I mean, there is something called the CanTrust Index. There's the Edelman Foundation work. I'm sure people are familiar with all that. What I'm frustrated by is all of that survey data on trust kind of conflates trust in government, and what you're blurring is people's attitudes to the politicians and the political institutions with their attitudes towards the public service. To the extent I've ever seen any data on that, at least in Canada and other countries, people do basically believe that government is impartial and objective and fair. They may not feel very warm and fuzzy about it, but they do see it as fair, whereas they often think very dimly of the politicians or the media.
Yes, absolutely. I think the UK definitely has trust that is broken down between trust in politicians and trust in civil servants, and civil servants score higher on that ranking, as I recall.
I think the notable exception in North America is policing. I mean, there's definitely a lack of trust in policing in a lot of communities for all kinds of reasons.
Annie, how is the Treasury kind of engaging around these questions on trust?
Yeah, we centralized in thinking about a couple years back. Richard, you mentioned by President Biden priority on customer experience and customer service, for example, and I think we kind of tackled this concept of what is satisfaction. So, you know, a long time in multiple countries too. I know in the UK we're thinking about what is satisfaction, and are we chasing satisfaction to this 90%? In my time and working with healthcare and hospitals, for example, you can give a survey to a patient and say how satisfactory were your visit, and they will say 3 out of 10, even though they got the care they need, got the medicine, etc., because parking was not free. Because parking was not free, you will always never get that satisfaction. So what are you really measuring, right, in terms of understanding that target of satisfaction there? And so we decided, and I think more broadly understood the experience and the customer experience instead of chasing satisfaction. Satisfaction is one of maybe an indicator, but no, not putting all our eggs in that one basket. And I think what that looks like is understanding trust in general, that it starts from the interfacing of citizens to services. And so if we are able to increase our services and experiences for these customers to a way where they are, it might be a forced interaction, unfortunately, right? I didn't get my tax credit, and so I have to call the IRS and call these people to get there, where I am forced into a transaction. But if I'm able to resolve it in a timely manner, in a way where I'm respected and whatnot, that will generally, what we have seen, increase the ability for government to be objective, fair, and to trust that we can carry out certain tasks and ask from the public. And I think that is increasingly why customer experience for now it's been a priority from the president's management agenda. A lot of agencies are trying to revamp where are our high service impact providers, for example, and seeing how we can scope better experience. All to say is, I think, our way to think about increasing trust in government. And we do know that those personal interactions, and not just about tax, right? Throughout your lifetime, you're going to be interacting on multiple fronts with multiple services for different agencies. How can we make this experience, enjoyable, but also functional and valuable to that customer?
Peter, do you have any thoughts on how governments can kind of undertake the kind of transformation projects that we've been touching on in today's conversation in a way that kind of carries citizens with them to make sure that everyone's able to make progress?
I think I'd be a brave chap to say yes. It's such a monumental task, right? And we're all familiar with it in some shape or form. I think just picking up on the trust thing for a second, from my personal experience, data breaches happen, unfortunately. It's usually through human error or some mistake, but it's rarely malicious. And from my experience working in various different areas, we have bigger issues about not sharing data of joined up government to be able to make decisions about the welfare of a child or something like that, that causes a far bigger issue, dare I say, to some extent than data breaches. That may sound a little bit trite and convenient, but I genuinely think that's probably where we're at. Equally, government itself is so large, there is no private organization out there with so much data and the vast amount of systems to try and look after. It's got a real mountain to climb. But I think one of the challenges around this and to the transformational agenda is the good news stories. Bad news travels way faster than good news. Always does, always has done, and probably always will do. So getting out those good news stories, being in the public domain about all the goodness that we are doing as a result of A, B, and C is probably something that needs more attention. If we turn into the news in the evenings, it's usually full of bad news. I can remember a time when there used to be a good news topic at the end of the news. Maybe I'm showing my age, but there's little things like that I just think is really, really hard for us as society to get our heads around. And I think there's a lot of generational change that needs to happen for some of these transformational needs to fall through as well. I'm clearly biased. I work in the technology industry and have done all my career, but I believe that if we can understand the problems that we're trying to fix, that's at least half of the equation. It's probably not technology that fixes it. It's usually people and understanding why something needs to be the way that it is, and then what's the most appropriate way of doing it. But we never seem to get to that at that initial phase. And I think public sector, as many, and I'm sure we'll all think of this one, how many people do you know that got promoted out of a given role because they were really good at that role, but they end up in a role that maybe they find themselves not particularly skilled for or trained for? And how do we support those individuals in that process? And back to the other panelist's point, we're just not helping ourselves on this transformational journey at the people level. The technology can help find the efficiencies, figure out the processes that need to be adapted and moved in the right direction. But it's always the 3 Ps: people, product, and process. And product in this case will be a public service delivery in some way, shape, or form.
Great, thank you, Peter. We've had a few questions in from Asatsu Sar. I'm not going to be able to get to them all soon, but the one that has grabbed my attention is the point you make about the current crisis has highlighted how a lack of clarity about the roles and responsibilities of national versus subnational governments. And you say that potentially leaves people vulnerable. Given that we have two panelists on today's webinar from federal systems, I wanted to explore that point a little bit. Michael, first perhaps, are the pressures that we've been discussing today federal pressures, or do you think if we conducted the same survey at provincial level in Canada or state level in the US when we get to Annie, we'd find the same issues?
Well, in the Canadian context, it would certainly be an experiment worth doing. People in the provincial governments in Canada tend to be right at the front counter of health, primary health care, primary education, social services at a very, front counter level. So I think their experiences would certainly be illustrative. This quest for clarity in a federal system is another one of those asymptotic things. We will never get there. Governments will be elected with different views about the state of the federation, as they should be. We have waxed and waned in Canada from governments that federal governments that take a very interventionist, it is a problem, we must herd the cats and solve the problem, and a lot of intervention at the federal level. And then we, at some other point in the political cycle, you get governments that say, whoa, we're going to stick to our knitting, deliver the things that the federal government is mandated to do, and give an enormous amount of autonomy and space to provincial and local governments to find their own solutions. And I think that is an ongoing thing, and we are condemned to manage ambiguity, is the way one of my bosses put it, and it is a skill set. It's worth developing and training and thinking about. That managing ambiguity is actually this quest for clarity across the 300 federal organizations. If we could just reach this nirvana where everybody is in their swim lanes and the roles are clear, if we could just reach this point where levels of government are in their, we'll never get there. Managing ambiguity actually is a key public sector leadership skill.
Annie, do you have thoughts on the differences, if there are some, between the federal level and the state level in the US?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Michael that on the state level, it's definitely the front lines. You are the teachers, you are the people who are giving the care, you are managing the actual health systems that are being delivered to be able to get folks healthy. And so there also might be other resource challenges that we don't see on the federal level. We look into federal policy, we look into how all states should behave a certain way and the laws. And when it really gets onto the implementation, that is really the hard part, and making a one size fit all doesn't always work. And I think state and local public servants are probably one of the most creative people that I have met, because of the circumstances that they are in, trying to efficiently but also effectively deliver their services on their perspective. So I would love to see a survey done on that data to see where those intricacies and how the federal government can help with some of those areas as well. I think one thing I'll also mention about just the difference of that ambiguity and unclarity, added uncertainty too, because overlaying some of those political sentiments, and you might have heard in the United States that our laws, courts are very busy, either trying to push back federal policy or laws, and states feel like they should have certain autonomy to do X, Y, Z. And so I agree that managing that uncertainty and that ambiguity is a must in federal service, and also probably state and local service, to try to get us to a point where we can be on the same page for serving the people, which is where we want to be ultimately.
And Peter, you mentioned in your example comments earlier how COVID had helped with some transformation projects, particularly those around that you're going to your local Waste Management Centre and being able to book that, which will have been a local government innovation rather than a national one. Do you sense it in your career, if is there a difference between the transformation appetite that local government and central government has? Is there a need for greater coordination between those two kind of spheres in the UK to kind of unlock some of the changes we've been discussing?
Yeah, I think there definitely is. I really feel for local government. It's caught between a rock and a hard place on so many different days of the week. It's got citizens on one side and it's got federal on the other. And I can't think of many more challenging environments in which to work. And I can recall a couple of situations whereby it's a decision over schools or car parks. I'm like, how on earth do you make that? One generates revenue, one is vastly needed. It's a really challenging environment. The one thing I'm convinced about is that I think central government needs to appreciate the nuances that local government faces. I may be being a little bit controversial to say it, maybe out of touch with what's going on at the local level somewhat. And certainly at the central level, they have their remit and they deliver their remit, and it's very boxed, it's very defined, everybody kind of roughly knows what they're doing. But local just is vast, goes in so many different directions. And all it takes is a flood or a pandemic or an outbreak of measles and everything stops, restarts and goes again. Rarely does the central kind of organizations face that challenge. But it's yeah, I would agree. I think it needs a refresh. I think it needs resetting. I think there needs to be greater appreciation and awareness on both sides. But if we don't change, this certainly isn't going to change.
I'm reminded of a webinar that we hosted on the UK civil service that we had Jonathan Slater, the former Permanent Secretary in the Department for Education, speaking on, and he formerly led the education department in Islington, one of the big councils in England, and he was kind of highlighting the difference to kind of build on the trust point. When he made a decision as the Director of Education in Islington Council, if you wanted to know his advice and his rationale, you could go down to Islington Town Hall on a Tuesday afternoon. He'd be in a public meeting explaining why he'd made the decision that he had, which he contrasted with the process at the Department for Education, where there's an occasional hearing before education select committees, but the kind of details of his policy advice was always kept private. And he was calling for greater transparency. And it is interesting when you move in your career, as I did, from local government to central government journalism, just the difference in terms of the information that's kind of made readily publicly available, and the stuff that you don't have to FOI just to get your hands on. That, I think, is where I'm going to bring our conversation to a close. We're almost out of time. It's a great conversation that I think we've had. Thank you, everybody, and apologies to all the questions that I've not been able to get to. But there were a lot of questions that came in today. So thank you, everybody who has been submitting those, and thank you to everybody who has been watching along. Thank you also, of course, to our panel. It's a really interesting report, and we did share the link as part of this conversation. But after this session, we will share an email with you that will include a link to the report. There will also be a survey that will be in your email inbox shortly too. Please do complete that. It's very helpful to me and the team at Global Government Forum if you are able to submit that, and let us know of any topics that you would like us to cover in future webinars. That makes my job easier too, if I can crowdsource those ideas. There will be a report on today's webinar on globalgovernmentforum.com too in the upcoming weeks, so please keep an eye on that, and also keep an eye on our upcoming webinar schedule. We run a lot of interesting policy webinars at GGF, and it would be great if you would able to register to attend some of the upcoming ones. yes, is where I'm going to bring our session to a close. Thank you once again to our panel, and wherever you are in the world, please enjoy the rest of your day.